The jungle had a way of swallowing sound. Even during the day, when parrots screamed from the canopy and insects buzzed in clouds thick enough to see, there was a heaviness to the air that made every footstep feel like a disturbance. But at night, the jungle became something else entirely. The 132nd Infantry Battalion had been marching for 11 days across one of the countless unnamed islands in the South Pacific. The place didn't have a town, or even a real coastline, just thick humid forest, brackish swamps, rising ridges, and sudden ravines that seemed to appear from nowhere. The maps were drawn by people who had never walked here. The men suspected even the birds hadn't flown this deep before the war came. They were exhausted. Their uniforms were always damp. Sweat never dried. The air clung to them like a second skin, warm and sticky and smelling of leaves, mud, and decay. Private Anthony Hale could not remember the last time he felt truly dry. Even his socks squelched when he walked. Tonight, though, the battalion wasn't marching. They had finally stopped in a clearing near a slow-moving river that wound like a dark ribbon through the undergrowth. They had been ordered to rest. They set up small perimeter positions, dug shallow foxholes, set out barbed wire and trip flares, though everyone knew that in this terrain, any alarm system was more hopeful than dependable. The sun went down quickly in the jungle. One moment the sky was orange, the next it was pitch black. The men ate quietly, mostly canned rations, taking small sips from their canteens because resupply was uncertain. A few spoke in low voices about home, about farms, factories, wives, children, but even these conversations faded. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the silence. The jungle, normally loud with life, had grown still. Hale noticed it first while sitting next to a tree at the edge of the camp. He held his rifle, not tightly, just resting it against his chest. He listened. No cicadas, no frogs, no birds, no rustling leaves. Just the faint whisper of the river, slow and thick. Something was wrong. He didn't say anything at first. Hale was not the kind of man who spoke easily. The others in the battalion saw him as simple, maybe even slow. He was polite, gentle, and rarely angry. The kind of man people overlooked. The kind of man who never led, never argued, never made decisions. But Hale's life before the war had not been spent in cities or factories. He grew up on a small farm in the Midwest, surrounded by open fields, quiet woods, and a wide horizon. His father had taught him to listen to nature. Birds always sang unless something frightened them. Wind moved leaves unless something was holding still and watching. Silence, his father said, was the loudest warning of all. Hale had learned to trust his nerves, even when his mind couldn't explain why. Now, as he sat at the edge of the camp, he felt that same wrongness settling around him like mist. A stillness that didn't belong. A waiting. He tried to push the thought away. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe the jungle animals were quiet because the battalion had disturbed them. That made sense, didn't it? It should have. But his gut twisted anyway. By the time the rest of the battalion drifted into restless sleep, the silence had deepened into something suffocating. The night seemed too dark, as if the moon itself had turned its face away. The only light came from the faint glow of cigarettes, hidden behind cupped hands, and the dim shine of stars through heavy canopy gaps. Hale was one of the 4 night sentries assigned to the perimeter. The others took their positions near the river, near the old fallen logs, and near the narrow animal path that led deeper into the jungle. Hale's post was near a cluster of tangled roots and vines that formed a small natural barricade. He adjusted his helmet. His throat felt dry, though the air felt wet enough to drink. He scanned the darkness. Nothing. No movement. No sound. And yet the dread did not fade. It grew. He swallowed. His heart beat too loudly in his ears. He tried to ease his breathing. He told himself he was imagining it. The commander, Captain Avery, had confidence in their defenses. The battalion was positioned in a defensible clearing. They had trip flares in place. They had a forward listening post. They weren't rookies anymore. They had been out here long enough to know what to watch for. But Hale knew something was wrong. The silence felt like a held breath. The jungle wasn't resting. It was hiding. The enemy was out there. He couldn't hear them, but he could feel them in the same way a deer senses wolves before they step from the brush. The kind of instinct you don't learn. You are born with it. Hale's eyes drifted to the edge of the clearing where an empty tin can lay beside a discarded ration box. He stared at it for a moment. The idea that formed in his mind didn't feel smart. It didn't feel tactical. Felt childish. Silly. Stupid. But he couldn't shake it. Something deep inside whispered, "Make noise. Break the silence. Disturb the stillness that isn't yours. Let the danger reveal itself." Hale slowly picked up the tin can. His hands were shaking just a little. He found a piece of string inside the ration box and tied it to the can's handle. Then he took the other end of the string and tied it to his belt. He stood up and began to walk slowly along the perimeter. The can dragged behind him, scraping lightly against the dirt and tangled roots. It made a soft metallic clatter. Not loud, but loud enough. Immediately, a soldier half asleep near the fire sat up. "What the hell are you doing, Hale?" he whispered harshly. Hale didn't answer. He just kept walking. The can rattled again, rolling over a stone. Another man stirred and muttered angrily. Someone hissed for him to stop making noise before he got them all killed. Hale ignored them. He didn't have words to explain what he felt. He only knew the silence was a trap, and his noise was a test. The can scraped the earth again, and this time there was an answer. A faint one, very faint, but unmistakable. A second metal clatter. From the jungle. Hale froze. His breath caught in his throat. The sound had come from the ridge just beyond the clearing. Then came another, and another. Soft, careful noises. Metal touching stone. Brush shifting lightly, not natural. Human. Close. Too close. Someone else was there. Many someones. They were creeping toward the sleeping battalion. An ambush. Hale's blood went cold. Before he could speak, the jungle erupted. Hale didn't shout. He didn't need to. The first burst of gunfire did it for him. A stuttering crack from the tree-line, aimed blindly into the camp, tore through the quiet like lightning splitting a silent sky. The jungle flared with muzzle flashes. Tiny sparks of orange in the dark. Men who were asleep jolted awake, grabbing rifles, diving into the mud, scrambling behind packs and fallen logs. Voices rose all at once, confused, half-coherent, some shouting names, others cursing. It was chaos, but it could have been much worse. Hale's rattling can had bought them seconds. Just enough seconds for instinct to catch up to survival. A machine gun opened up from the ridge, stitching bullets across the clearing. Sparks flew off helmets and rocks. Dirt jumped in angry fountains. A tent collapsed as its ropes were shredded. Men scattered, rolling, crawling, desperate to get below the bullets. Hale himself threw his body behind a thick tree root, pressing his cheek into the damp earth as splinters rained down around him. Captain Avery appeared almost instantly, as if pulled from the darkness itself. He didn't hesitate. Positions. Get to your sectors. Keep your spacing. His voice cut clean through the panic, sharp and commanding. He had led men long enough to know the hardest moment was the first. Corporal Darrow dragged the squad's bar gunner toward a fallen log. The gunner, a young man named Reeves, slammed the bipod down and began firing slow, controlled bursts toward the flashes on the ridge. The heavy weapon bucked, spitting fire, its dull rhythmic beat answering the sharper cracks of enemy rifles. Other men followed suit. Rifles barked. Grenades were armed but held back, too close to their own lines to throw yet. The jungle flickered with muzzle flashes on both sides, each burst carving momentary images into the night. The curve of a helmet, the glint of sweat on a cheek, the arch of a recoiling shoulder. Hale crawled to a better position, pulling his rifle tight to his chest. His heartbeat hammered so loud he felt his vision tremble. He tried to breathe slow. His father always said panic made hands shake and shaky hands killed hunters. He listened for the enemy's movements between shots. There, above, on the slope. They were not firing while charging. They were firing to suppress, to freeze the battalion in place. The real danger was movement in the underbrush, the creeping advance of the attack line. Hale pressed his cheek against the stock, steadied his breath, and squeezed the trigger. His rifle kicked. The recoil was familiar, grounding. He fired again and again. He couldn't see the enemy clearly, only shadows, but he could tell their position by where the leaves shivered when bullets hit them. To his left, Sergeant Ibarra shouted orders. Shift fire left. They're flanking. The enemy was trying to encircle them. They wanted to squeeze the battalion inward, trap them against the river, cut off retreat, and overwhelm them in the dark. That had been the plan from the start. Quiet approach, surround, then strike. And it would have worked if not for the tin can. Mortar fire cracked from the rear of the battalion line as the weapons team finally got set. Small explosions thudded against the ridge, sending leaves and dirt raining down. The jungle glowed in brief orange bursts. But the enemy kept advancing. They were experienced. These were not newly deployed troops. They were patient, silent, moving low, crawling through ferns and vines with machetes clearing their way. Hale saw shapes moving below the ridge, slipping between shadows. The battalion was fighting, but they were still vulnerable. The men were firing wide, still waking up, still finding targets. The enemy was closer than anyone realized. Hale could hear them breathing soft, controlled, measured. He knew if he shouted, his voice would get lost in the gunfire. So instead, he did something else. He grabbed the tin can again. The string was still tied to his belt. He lifted it, crawled forward, and threw it toward the noise he heard, toward where the enemy was approaching low through the brush. The can bounced, rattling against roots and stones. Immediately, 3 enemy soldiers reacted. They snapped their rifles up toward the sound and fired. Hale saw the muzzle flashes. He fired back 3 shots, fast and steady. The 2 nearest shapes crumpled. The 3rd dove behind a tree. But now the others had seen it too. The battalion's rifles shifted. Their fire concentrated. The pressure of the flank eased. One stupid rattle in the dark had again given away a hidden threat. Captain Avery saw it. He understood. Hale saw him look, just for a second, but in that second was everything. Recognition, not of intelligence, not of bravery, but of instinct. Avery pointed toward Hale. Keep doing what you're doing. Hale didn't answer. He didn't need to. He moved again, crawling to another point along the perimeter, dragging the can lightly so the metal sang just enough to be heard. Each time he moved, the enemy reacted. Each time they reacted, they revealed themselves. And each time, the battalion adjusted fire before the enemy could strike. What should have been a silent advance had turned into a clumsy, exposed crawl. The ambush timing was ruined. The enemy commander realized it. Hale heard someone whistle sharply, signal to pull back and regroup. But retreat under fire is dangerous. Some soldiers rose too quickly and were cut down. Others crawled backward, dragging wounded. A few tried to rush downhill in panic and slipped on wet leaves, falling into view of the machine gun Reeves controlled. The heavy weapon tore through the dark, shredding foliage and sending echoes ricocheting through the trees. By the time the enemy broke contact and melted back into the jungle, the clearing was quiet again, but not like before. The silence was earned. The kind that comes after survival, not before death. Hale sat back against a tree. His hands shook now, but the danger had passed. The battalion doctor moved between the wounded. Captain Avery checked positions, counted heads, asked quick questions. No one spoke loudly. Voices were hushed, tired, disbelieving. Someone said softly, "If they'd hit us in our sleep, none of us would be here." Someone else answered, "Hale saved us." Hale shook his head. "No, it just felt wrong." But the men knew, and Avery knew, and the jungle itself, which now slowly returned to life with distant insect calls, seemed to know too. Hale didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat where he was, listening to the jungle breathe again. The tin can rested in the dirt beside him, scratched, dented, ordinary. But it had become something else now. A lifeline, a chance, a stupid trick that saved a battalion, a mistake that wasn't a mistake. And somewhere deep in the trees, the enemy licked their wounds and wondered how their perfect silence had betrayed them. Hale knew the answer. Silence holds predators. Noise wakes the hunted. The men froze where they were. No one spoke. Even breathing felt like something that could get them killed. Patterson crouched next to Hale, eyes locked on the dark line of shapes slowly forming between the trees near the perimeter. The Japanese patrol moved with caution, rifles held low, bayonets angled. They were scouting, probing, checking for survivors or stragglers. "They're testing the silence," Hale whispered. Patterson nodded. If the Americans fired first, the Japanese would scatter into the jungle and call in artillery or grenades. If they stayed quiet for too long, the Japanese would walk right into them and the fighting would get messy and loud anyway. Patterson had been in 2 small engagements before, but this was different. This was dozens of men packed together, every muscle locked. The situation felt like being a deer surrounded by wolves that had not yet decided to attack. Hale leaned to the nearest runner. "Tell every squad leader, hold fire unless they see the whites of the enemy's eyes. No mistakes." The runner nodded and vanished with careful steps, touching shoulders as he passed instructions silently. The jungle had a way of making people feel both invisible and exposed at the same time. Every sound seemed too loud. Each snap of a twig sounded like a thunderclap. The Japanese patrol stopped. The lead soldier raised his fist. The entire column behind him froze in perfect unison. The man cocked his head, listening. Patterson's heart thudded so hard he feared it would echo. Hale's jaw clenched. Then the Japanese soldier did something none of them expected. He took 1 step forward, reached into his tunic, pulled out a small wooden flute, and began to play. The tune was soft, warbling, a lonely sound that floated through the humid night like a bird call. Patterson's blood chilled. "They're reaching out," Hale muttered. "They think if anyone's alive in here, someone will shift. Move. React." It was a psychological trap. And it was working. One of the privates near Patterson swallowed loudly. Another trembled, his leg twitching. Patterson put a hand on the man's boot. "Steady. Don't move. Don't break." The tune continued for nearly a minute. Then silence. The patrol listened again. Patterson didn't know how long the stillness lasted. Time lost shape in fear. Then, with a quiet hand signal, the Japanese patrol stepped forward again. This time slowly and directly toward the collapsed bunker. They were going to discover the bodies. And if they counted them, if they saw the wrong positions, if they noticed the tracks, everything would be over. Hale's hand hovered near his rifle. Patterson felt his pulse crack like lightning. And then snap. A twig behind the Japanese patrol. The lead soldier spun, raising his rifle. But the sound hadn't come from Hale's line. It had come from the darkness behind the Japanese. Another group. They weren't just scouting. They were surrounding. Hale realized it at the same time Patterson did. His face drained of color. "They're closing a ring," he whispered. If the Japanese completed the circle, the battalion would be trapped in a noose of fire and steel. No escape. No retreat. Patterson didn't think. He acted. He grabbed Hale's sleeve. "Sir." "The lights." Hale blinked, confused for a moment, then shock. He understood. The Japanese expected darkness. Darkness meant stealth. Darkness meant ambush. But light meant control, organization, prepared defense. A force not hiding but waiting. Japanese tactics relied on intimidation through surprise. They needed the Americans to feel hunted. But Patterson intended to flip that. Light the torches. Show strength. Make the enemy think the Americans were confident, alert, numerically secure. It was a bluff. A massive one. If the Japanese called it, every man here would die. Hale swallowed hard. "Do it." The order spread like a spark. Patterson rushed to the fuel cans stacked near the perimeter. He ripped cloth into strips and jammed them into the nozzles. The men worked fast, silently, hands shaking but efficient. Then Patterson struck the match. The first flame burst to life, bright, wild, almost too bright for eyes accustomed to the dark. Then the second torch. Then the third. Then dozens. The entire American defensive ring bloomed into blazing, flickering firelight. The jungle lit up in red-gold waves, shadows dancing across trunks and leaves. The Japanese patrol froze. The soldiers in the trees stopped. The ring they were forming stalled mid-step. Suddenly, the Americans were no longer prey. They were a fort, a camp, a defended position held by men who were awake. Hale stood up tall, silhouetted in the firelight, rifle slung, shoulders squared, posture of calm command. Patterson stood beside him, torch smoke curling around them both. For a moment, the night held its breath. No gunfire, no war cry, just two armies staring at each other through fire. The Japanese leader slowly lowered his rifle. He made a hand signal, and just like that, the patrol slipped back into the trees. Gone. Melted away like mist. Hale exhaled. Patterson realized he had forgotten to breathe. They had just bluffed death and won. But the danger wasn't gone. The Japanese hadn't given up. They were regrouping, rethinking, watching, and the Americans had only a few hours until dawn. They would need to prepare, strengthen the line, ration ammunition, set listening posts. Hale turned to Patterson. "You bought us time." Patterson nodded, chest tight. "Then we use it." The battalion went to work in the flickering firelight. Quiet, fast, determined. No one spoke of fear now, just survival, just resolve. The night watchman's trick had worked once. But the war was far from finished. And the next attack, when it came, would not be cautious. It would be furious. It would be teeth and steel. And they all knew it. The first light of dawn seeped slowly into the jungle, pale and washed out like a timid ghost. The firelight had long died, leaving smoldering torches and streaks of smoke that curled upward into the dense canopy. Hale had not slept. Neither had Patterson. Neither had most of the men on perimeter duty. Every rustle, every bird call, every drop of water sliding off a leaf made them flinch. The enemy had retreated, yes, but that retreat was only temporary. They would return. And Hale knew the Japanese wouldn't come quietly. They had been patient, careful, meticulous. Now, with daylight filtering through the trees, they would be precise, aggressive, merciless. Captain Avery called a quiet council near the small command post. A low-hanging canopy of vines and rotting leaves. Maps were spread on wet logs, ink smeared and hard to read. The captain spoke in clipped tones, precise, deliberate. He pointed at the tree-line, at each path, at the ridges. He traced the jungle with his finger. "They'll try again. They'll hit where we are weak. They'll use the jungle to channel us into traps. They know what we did last night. They'll anticipate our reactions." Patterson and Hale nodded. "Positions. Double the guards on the flanks. Listen posts 20 meters out. Do not let anything pass unnoticed." And Hale, Avery's eyes lingered. "That trick worked. Don't underestimate your instincts again. Keep your eyes open." Hale swallowed and nodded. His stupid trick had already changed the course of events, but he wasn't sure he deserved praise. It had been luck, chance, instinct, maybe all three, but now there was no room for mistakes. The men spent hours preparing. They moved quietly, coordinating signals with small whistles, flags, and hand gestures. Every piece of equipment was checked, rifles cleaned, ammunition counted. Trip flares were reset, and extra sets were placed along likely approach routes. Small trenches were deepened, logs stacked, vines tied in tension to trip or snag anyone moving too fast. Hale moved among them, helping silently, offering advice where he could. He was no officer, but he had seen the enemy up close in the dark, had felt the danger, had understood the jungle in a way that maps and orders couldn't convey. Hours passed. The sun climbed, but the canopy kept the ground in dim green shadow. The humidity pressed down. Sweat ran down Hale's back, soaking his shirt. Birds began to call hesitantly, insects slowly returned, and the river burbled lazily as if oblivious to the human conflict nearby. And then, just before noon, it began. A faint rustling at first, like leaves brushing together. A shadow between two trunks. Then more, dozens of them, moving carefully, deliberately, through the ferns and tall grass. The Japanese had returned. Hale felt his stomach twist. His heart hammered. This was the real assault. They weren't probing. They weren't testing. They were attacking, using every tactic the jungle allowed. Camouflage, silent movement, sudden flares, snipers hidden in high branches. But the battalion was ready. Rifles were up. Mortars were manned. Ammunition belts clicked. Every soldier knew his sector. Every position had a backup. Hale crawled to a knotted root near the riverbank and peered through the brush. A group of Japanese soldiers moved in a narrow wedge, careful, scanning, silent, deadly. Patterson dropped beside him. "Do you see them?" Hale nodded. "Yes, keep low. Watch the flank." The first shot was fired by one of the forward listening posts. A single rifle crack that broke the suspense like glass. It was immediately followed by a burst of automatic fire from the rear perimeter, then mortar fire thudding into the undergrowth ahead of the enemy. The Japanese scattered, trying to find cover. Hale's hands shook, but his aim remained true. Every shot that found its target slowed the enemy advance, disrupted their formations. But they kept coming. Another group tried to flank from the opposite side. Hale dragged his tin can behind him again, just enough to create noise near the opposite flank. The enemy reacted instantly, exposing their positions. Mortars and rifles followed, picking off soldiers before they could reach the line. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos. The battalion functioned like a machine, responding to sound and instinct simultaneously. The tin can rattle, initially mocked as foolish, became a tool again. A decoy, a lure, a way to manipulate movement in the jungle. Hours passed like minutes. Sweat, mud, blood, and fear blended into a blur. Soldiers fell, some wounded, some dead, some screaming. Hale ignored the chaos, moving silently, dragging his can, firing when necessary. By late afternoon, the Japanese assault began to falter. Their wedges broke. Their coordination cracked. The jungle that had once been a deadly advantage now trapped them as much as the Americans, who knew every inch of their perimeter. Patterson yelled orders, Captain Avery shouted, but the men executed without hesitation. By evening, the battalion had repelled the attack entirely. The enemy fell back into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, rifles, and bodies. The survivors melted into the undergrowth, defeated, demoralized. Hale collapsed to the wet ground, gasping for breath. Patterson fell beside him. "We made it," Patterson said quietly. "We actually made it." Hale didn't answer. He stared at the trees, at the trails of movement still vanishing into the darkness. He knew they had survived, but the jungle was patient. It never forgave. The battalion had held, thanks to preparation, bravery, and yes, a tin can dragged foolishly across the mud in the dead of night. Captain Avery walked past, hand on Hale's shoulder. "You changed the course of this battle, Hale. That little trick, it saved lives. Hundreds of men. Don't forget that." Hale shook his head. "It felt stupid," he muttered. Avery smiled faintly, eyes hard with experience. "Sometimes, stupid works better than strategy." Night came again, and the men finally rested. Hale stayed awake a little longer, watching the stars through the thick leaves. The jungle was alive again, but he could sense that this calm was temporary. He had seen the danger, felt the instinct, acted and survived. And the battalion survived. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt small, lucky, tired. But he had learned something that the maps, orders, and training could never teach. Instinct, courage, and a single ridiculous idea could tilt the balance of life and death in the heart of a merciless jungle. Hale drifted to sleep finally, listening to the river, the wind, the distant calls of insects, knowing he had faced the darkness and come out alive. The 132nd Infantry Battalion had survived the night and the day because one man dared to make noise when silence threatened to kill them all. He had been overlooked, underestimated, thought foolish. And yet, in the silence, in the stillness, he had been the difference between life and death. The jungle would continue to whisper its threats, the sun would rise again, and the battalion would march onward, but that night, the night of the tin can, the night of instinct, would be remembered quietly, in hearts and minds, for as long as anyone lived to tell the story.